a new year, the question is not, where were you in 2002? As much as, where will you be in 2003? In review. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Russom Mesfun. You are listening to a special presentation of the Face of the Erespora. Eritrea veers from renaissance to ridicule. At first, people made sure that no one was watching. Only when it became safe to do so did they start looking at each other. But when things got even worse than feared, they whispered, "Something is wrong with this picture." In 2002, the civilized whispers had turned loud and shrill.
Peace! Down with dictatorship! Dictator has to go! Dictator has to go! Dictator must go! Dictator must go! Respect our people! Respect our people! Respect human rights! Respect human rights! We demand free press! We demand free press! We demand democracy!
Eritreans will remember the year PFDJ was at its worst. Unable to cope with its oppressive practices, thousands fled their country.
This ንኸባብ ሰሜን አፍሪካ ወስደና ኣብ ሜዲትራንያን ባሕሪ ኣብ ትርከብ ማልታ ኣብ ትበሃል ሃገር ልዕሊ 370 ዕቑባ ዝሓቱ ኤርትራውያን ተኣሲሮም ከም ዘለዉ ብገለ ማዕኸናት ዜናን ኤርትራውያን ማሕበራትን ክንገር ጸኒሑ ኣሎ። ንሳቶም ንጽባሕ ሰሉስ ናይ መግቢ ምሕሳም ኣድማ ንምግባር ተዳልዮም ከም ዘለዉ እውን ይገልጹ ኣለዉ። ንኹነታቶም ንምፍላጥ ተወልደ ወልደ ገብርኤል ናብቲቶም ስደተኛታት ዝርከብሉ ደሴት ማልታ ደው ኢሉ ንገለ ካብቶም ኤርትራውያን ስደተኛታት ኣዘራሪቦ ኣሎ። ናብኡ ከሕልፈኩም
ንሕና ናይ ኣብ ኩናት ዲና ተማሪኽና ወላ ፋብሪካ ዲና ቃቲልና ዝገበርና ይስጠፊና ኣሎ። ንሕና ስደተኛታት ኢና መጀመርታ ትስገር ኣጋጠመና ረድኤትና ሓቲትና እዮም እሳቶም ከዓ ሕራይ ኢሎም እዮም ይተውና ድሓር ግን ኣብ ረፊጅ ክትሓትለኩም ኢሎም ከዓ ይሕትቶሙና ማለት እዩ እቲ ረፊጅ እውን ክተሻዕ ነጭግና ማለት እዩ ብድሕሪኡ እንታይ ይትዕድል ስለዚ እቲ ሰብ ዓቕሉ የፅብብ ኣሎ ስጋዕ ናይ ዓቕሊ ፅበት ዋላ ናይ ነፍሲ ቅትለት ከማን ክገብር ሰብሲ ይዳናድና ኣሎ
Those who were not able to get away were chased into their homes and thrown to jail. If they were lucky enough, they were dispatched to Sawa to perform what the government said was national service. Naturally, a different fate awaited Eritrean women. Apart from all other duties of their male counterparts, they were to be at the beck and call of a unit leader or anyone who happened to be a superior officer.
Eritrea, a North African country rebuilding after decades of war. But also a country that hides a terrible secret. Thousands of young people to complete military service in Sawa, a place some people simply call rape camp. One who should know is this man, who works in Sawa, and spoke to us through an interpreter, but wished to remain anonymous.
If you don't like it, everything is weird, so that's why they are writing.
Yes, 2002 would be remembered as a year parents wished their children would not grow taller and or older. In an unprecedented move, Eritreans in the diaspora took the regime to court to retrieve borrowed funds under the pretext of national defense. the petitioners decided to do so only because the government had failed to tender a mere explanation. After a lengthy hibernation, the nation's president, Isaias Afwerki, decided to have a word or two with the press. The government's own, that is. But it was to inform the parents, among other things.
أسمرا دارجا شاكا أخوين محبي ناي حدمتي محبي خوف قبوم فتصام لهادمو محبي ناي قلنا بفتصمو محبي أب بعلوك مدوات الوافر من
Yes, the president told his audience that their sons and daughters had turned Eritrea's capital into a thick hideaway. And like a school principal chastising an errant pupil, he sternly admonished them that the youth were trying to shirk their civic duties. Who in his right mind was to talk back that the same parents had lost not just children, but brave men and women who have yet to receive a decent burial? Who was to respond to Eritrea's only principle that the parents had fewer children to offer than the regime's number of enemies across the African and Middle Eastern landscape? Like the rest of its contemporaries, Eritrea does have a foreign policy, albeit a confused and a confusing one. For instance, on one side of its mouth, the government wished the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein well. On the other, it desperately and pathetically pleaded with the U.S. to please use Eritrea as a launching pad to dispose the same tyrant. This was to pass without even the benefit of a UN resolution or a make-believe consent of the so-called Eritrean National Assembly. Yes, that National Assembly. And speaking of the National Assembly, our men and women in Parliament got together after 18 months. And did they decide anything at all? In fact, they did. They went home after declaring that Eritrea was not ready for multi-partyism in the near future. They have a point. Why talk about multi-parties when we don't even have a real parliament? Or a real government, for that matter. Moving on, Asmara accused the Sudanese government of imprisoning Eritreans indiscriminately. In truth, of course, Sudan would have no refugees to incarcerate if Eritrea did not have the PFDJ. For a perpetual refugee-producing system to appear to be the defender for Eritreans in exile is like a beast shedding tears over the plight of its prey. Ethiopia, Sudan, and Yemen found out that they have something in common. Their contempt for the government in Asmara. More troublesome to the regime, however, should be that the Eritrean people have developed an even deeper disdain than that of the three neighboring nations combined. Further afield, the government made enemies the way other nations establish relationships. In 2002 alone, Eritrea's president and his ever-shrinking inner circle picked up fights even when it was not necessary to do so, or when matters could have been settled diplomatically. At one point, the regime postured as if to get eyeball to eyeball with the Bush administration. And you may ask, what exactly was the problem? Well, the State Department had finally awakened to the fact that the government was more apt to perpetrate terrorism on its own people than to apprehend Al-Qaeda terrorists. To be sure, no one accused the U.S. of consistent human rights policies abroad or even at home. Still, the Eritrean government's swift reply to charge that its record was dismal will be remembered as one of the most dangerously amateurish ever in the annals of international diplomacy. Eritreans who had looked the other way as their new president lashed out at a gathering of African leaders in Cairo a decade ago and continued to behave as such, were to learn that their country was in the hands of a reckless tyrant. At home, for the second time in a generation, the Eritrean people have had to deal with the fatal scourges of war and drought. While rain failure is to blame for the current humanitarian crisis, the Eritrean people have yet to find out the real causes of what is generally referred as one of the most senseless wars ever fought. And as if that's not enough, our country is still cursed with an ill-equipped leadership that has neither domestic nor international credibility. Talk about a perfect storm. A people ravaged by war are faced with a drought of cataclysmic proportions. And to top it all off, the government to manage such a horrendous crisis is none other than one of the most inept. Even Eritrea's worst enemies could not have concocted a more deadly combination. To absolve itself of responsibility for the human catastrophe awaiting the nation, the government alerted the international community that the lives of hundreds of thousands of Eritreans were at stake. However, in sharp contrast to previous appeals for assistance, the world community almost ignored appeals for help, a reaction that has to do with a growing belief that the Eritrean government is a huge part of the problem. In the 1984-85 famine, Eritrea was under the clutch of a brutal military government and somewhat powerless to fend for itself. Almost 2 decades later, the curse that had afflicted consecutive Ethiopian administrations had struck Eritrea. It might be a bit late to do anything about the last war, but the Eritrean people have within them the power, the passion, and the yearning for freedom within to uproot once and for all this poor excuse of a government from its foundations. Absent any action, Eritrea's children will be subjected to only more wars, more devastation, and more prisons. Remember the not-so-distant old days when we were supposed to have avoided Africa's chronic ailments of disease, poverty, and decaying governments. In 2001, Eritrea joined the Zimbabwe Club of embarrassing governments. In 2002, our country plunged even deeper into the dark, joining the company of the lowest of the law, this time Swaziland. In the unlikely possibility that you've not heard of Swaziland previously, it belongs to a 34-year-old King Mswati, Africa's only absolute monarch. Like Eritrea, Swaziland is also one of the poorest nations on earth and the most repressed. Such stark realities notwithstanding, a group of learned Eritrean men, and they were all men, gathered in Washington, D.C. recently, not to relieve the nation of its current despair, but to provide comfort to the very government that was responsible for the predicament in which the young nation finds itself. Still, 2002 had its shining moments. In a political coup of a kind, and much to the chagrin and nervousness of the regime in Eritrea, 14 opposition groups assembled in the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa during the last part of the year. Only the temporary rift between the Eritrean National Alliance and the Eritrean Liberation Front Revolutionary Council would allow the government a breather. Fortunately for the beleaguered Eritrean people, both sides to the quarrel had vitally decided they need to go back to the negotiating table. Hopefully, 2003 will witness the completion of the circle. Democratic elements, including those within and without the PFDJ, will have to join. Lest any Eritrean forget, we are in this splendid mess purely because of the wicked culture of exclusion of the current ruling elite. The year saw Samara Kasete, the former student union president of Asmara University, bowled out of prison. But the best part was that he was fully assisted by a PFDJ soldier, Mahari Yohannes, who had risked it all. The regime could not have looked any more unglued. To make matters worse, Kasete refused to take a break and went right back to work, in spying Eritreans from one end of the world to the other. This regime must be gone. Horrified Eritreans seemed to scream in unison upon hearing his testimony of a nation besieged by a ruthless clique. To the multitude of ill-informed Eritreans, one only hopes that they would read the writing on the wall. To those who have deliberately employed themselves to the services of one of the most hated governments in Africa, it's not too late to make up. As you listen to this broadcast, imagine that an Eritrean deep in the heart of the nation is secretly reading an article, softly whispering to a relative or a friend, seeking a way to escape, figuring out a method to get rid of the government. Even in their sleep, Eritreans must be dreaming of the days when this nightmare will be no more. Only yesterday, Africa's horizons were fraught with the likes of Frederick Chiluba in Zambia, Jerry Rawlings in Ghana, and Arap Moi in Kenya. These despots are not only gone forever, they can't even walk on Main Avenue without being hissed and booed. Recently, the Kenyans were able to claim their country back due to their awareness that they needed to be united to counter the divide and rule tactics of Arap Moi. And when push came to shove, the Yugoslavs had to choose between Slobodan Milosevic or their country. They happily surrendered their leader to the International Court of Justice. Eritrea has to do no less. Congratulations to all Eritreans from Africa, to Australia, to Sweden, Britain, Canada, and the US, who went on the offensive against PFDJ satellites and formed their own associations. The lesson to all of us is to organize, organize, and organize. As we embark on a new year, the question is not, where were you in 2002? As much as, where will you be in 2003? Ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to a special presentation of the Face of the Erespora. My name is Russom Mesfun. Happy New Year to you, to Eritreans around the world. Goodbye.